There is a particular kind of silence that unsettles people more than any shout. It is the silence of someone who understands everything happening in the room, but chooses to say nothing. You have felt this silence before, sitting across from a person who never raises their voice, never argues, never explains themselves, and yet somehow leaves you feeling exposed, as if they have already read your next 3 moves before you have made your first. This is not weakness. This is not fear. This is one of the oldest and most dangerous forms of power ever practiced by human beings, and almost no one alive today understands it correctly. We live in a culture addicted to noise. We are taught that the loudest voice wins the meeting, the fastest talker wins the negotiation, the person who explains themselves the most is the most trustworthy. This is a lie, and it is a lie that keeps the majority of people permanently weak. The truly intelligent learned centuries ago that speech is a currency, and like any currencies, the moment you spend it carelessly, you become poor. Every word you release into a room is information handed to someone who did not earn it. Every explanation you give is a door left open for someone to walk through and use against you later. The people who rise the highest, who accumulate the most quiet influence, who are never quite fully understood by anyone, they mastered a discipline that looks like nothing from the outside, but is in fact one of the most demanding forms of self-control a human being can practice. Today I am going to show you exactly why the sharpest minds in history chose silence as their primary weapon, and how this single shift can change the entire trajectory of your life. There is a moment early in most people's lives when they discover that talking feels good. A clever remark lands and the room laughs. An insight is shared and heads nod in admiration. This feeling is intoxicating, and it is precisely here that the trap is set. The applause of a room teaches the mind a dangerous lesson. That value is proven through speech. From this moment forward, the ordinary mind begins to equate silence with invisibility and invisibility with irrelevance. This is the first and most costly misunderstanding of human psychology. Consider what actually happens the instant you speak. You transfer something of yourself into the open air, your opinion, your knowledge, your intention, your weakness, disguised as confidence. Once released, this information cannot be recalled. It travels through the room, is filtered through the biases and insecurities of everyone listening, and settles into their memory in a shape you no longer control. You believe you are building your reputation with every clever sentence. In reality, you are handing out fragments of yourself to people who will later use those fragments however suits them. Flattery when it benefits them, ammunition when it does not. The intelligent understand this instinctively, even if they cannot always articulate it. They notice across years of observation a curious pattern. The people who talk the most in any group are rarely the ones who end up holding real power within that group. The loud ones entertain, the quiet ones accumulate. While the talkative mind is busy performing its intelligence for an audience, the quiet mind is doing something far more valuable. It is watching. Watching is the discipline almost no one practices anymore. In a world of constant commentary, where everyone feels compelled to have an opinion on everything within seconds of encountering it, the simple act of withholding judgment has become almost radical. But withholding judgment is not passivity. It is the highest form of active intelligence. When you resist the urge to react immediately, you create a gap, a space in which you can observe what others reveal about themselves in their own rush to speak. People betray far more about their intentions, their fears, and their weaknesses in unguarded speech than they ever intend to. The quiet person becomes a collector of this information. While everyone else is too busy talking to notice they are giving it away, there is also a deeper, more uncomfortable truth buried in this pattern. Most talking is not communication at all. It is a form of anxiety management. People speak to relieve the discomfort of silence, to fill space that feels unbearable, to reassure themselves that they exist and matter in the eyes of others. Watch closely in any meeting, any dinner table, any negotiation. A significant portion of what is said serves no strategic purpose whatsoever. It is noise generated by nervous systems that cannot tolerate stillness. The person who has trained themselves to tolerate that stillness, who can sit in a silence that makes everyone else desperate to fill it, holds an invisible advantage that compounds with every interaction. This is why history's most formidable strategists, negotiators, and rulers cultivated reticence as a deliberate skill rather than a personality trait. They understood something the talkative mind never grasps. That unpredictability is a form of protection. If people can predict exactly what you think, exactly how you will react, exactly what you know, they can plan around you. They can manipulate you with precision because they have a complete map of your interior world. But if you remain difficult to read, if your true assessments are never fully disclosed, you become impossible to plan against. Your opponents, colleagues, even your allies must proceed with a degree of caution that quietly transfers power into your hands. None of this means the intelligent are cold or emotionless. It means they have separated two things that the untrained mind constantly confuses: having a reaction and displaying a reaction. Every human being feels anger, excitement, doubt, and judgment constantly. The undisciplined mind believes these feelings must be voiced the instant they arise. The disciplined mind understands that a feeling voiced too early is a feeling that can be used against you, while a feeling held privately retains its full strategic value until the moment it is needed. This is the first lesson, and it is the foundation for everything that follows. Speech is not proof of intelligence. It is, more often than people realize, proof of a mind still enslaved to the need for immediate validation. The path toward real power begins the moment you stop needing the room to know what you are thinking. Imagine two merchants standing in the same marketplace. One announces the price he paid for every item, explains exactly how much profit he intends to make, and tells every customer precisely how much he is willing to negotiate downward. The other merchant reveals none of this. He watches, listens, and lets the customer speak first. Which merchant do you imagine walks away wealthier at the end of the season? This simple image captures something essential about how information functions as currency in every human interaction, not merely in commerce. Every conversation is at some level a negotiation for status, for advantage, for the outcome each party wants. And in every negotiation, the party who reveals less retains more leverage. This is not cynicism. It is simply how information behaves once it changes hands. The moment someone possesses complete knowledge of your position, your limits, and your intentions, they no longer need to guess. They can calculate. And a person who can calculate you has already won before the exchange has properly begun. This is why the intelligent treat their own knowledge, opinions, and plans the way a skilled investor treats capital. Never distributed carelessly, always deployed with a purpose. Before speaking, they ask a question almost no one else bothers to ask. What does saying this actually accomplish? Not what does it feel satisfying to say, not what would make me look clever in this moment, but what tangible advantage does releasing this information give me? If the honest answer is none, the wise choice is silence, regardless of how strong the urge to speak might be. Consider how this plays out in something as ordinary as office politics. The employee who cannot resist sharing every idea the moment it occurs to them hands their thinking to colleagues who may repackage it as their own, to superiors who now know exactly what to expect from them, to competitors within the same organization who can position themselves accordingly. The employee who learns to sit on ideas, to release them only at the moment of maximum strategic value, in the meeting where it will be attributed correctly, in the conversation where it will land with the right person, accumulates influence that the constant talker never manages to build, no matter how genuinely intelligent their ideas may be. There is a particular vulnerability that talkative people rarely notice in themselves. The compulsion to prove they are smart in the moment costs them the ability to be perceived as smart over time. A single brilliant remark in a meeting is quickly forgotten. A pattern of restraint followed by rare but devastatingly accurate observations builds something far more durable, a reputation. People begin to associate your silence with depth. They begin to lean forward when you finally choose to speak because they have learned through repeated experience that your words are not wasted on trivialities. This effect compounds in ways that are easy to underestimate. Scarcity creates value in every domain of human psychology, and speech is no exception. A person who comments on everything trains the people around them to filter out most of what they say, the same way the mind learns to ignore constant background noise. A person who speaks rarely trains the people around them to pay close attention every single time, because they have learned that nothing is being said without reason. You are, quite literally, training the perception of everyone around you through the pattern of your own restraint. There is also a defensive dimension to this discipline that deserves close attention. Information given away in careless conversation does not simply disappear once the moment passes. It becomes part of a permanent record other people carry about you. Every opinion you voice too freely, every judgment you make too publicly, every plan you disclose too early becomes a piece of intelligence that others can use, sometimes years later, in circumstances you cannot currently predict. The wise understand that today's careless remark can become tomorrow's leverage in someone else's hands. This is why they treat every disclosure as a permanent transaction rather than a passing comment, because in practice, it often is exactly that. None of this requires dishonesty. There is a crucial distinction between withholding and deceiving. The disciplined mind does not need to lie to protect itself. It simply needs to control the timing and completeness of what it reveals. Silence is not the absence of truth. It is truth held in reserve, released only when it serves a genuine purpose. This distinction is what separates strategic reticence from manipulation, and it is precisely why the most respected figures throughout history were rarely known as liars, but were almost universally known as people who said less than everyone expected them to. There is an old observation about predators in the natural world that applies with unsettling precision to human behavior. The creature that reveals its position first is almost always the one that ends up being hunted. In the animal kingdom, stillness is not passivity, it is strategy. The predator that moves prematurely, that reacts before fully understanding its environment, gives away critical information about its intentions and location. The predator that waits, that studies the terrain and the behavior of everything around it before committing to action, holds an overwhelming advantage the moment it finally decides to strike. Human social environments operate on remarkably similar principles, though we rarely describe them this way because it feels uncomfortable to acknowledge. Every room you enter, a meeting, a negotiation, a social gathering, a family conflict, contains a hidden architecture of power, alliance, and intention that is not immediately visible. The untrained mind walks into this room and immediately begins participating, speaking, reacting, revealing preferences and opinions before it has any real understanding of the dynamics at play. The trained mind does something entirely different. It enters the room and, for a period of time that feels almost unbearable to the untrained observer, does very little at all except watch. This watching is not idle curiosity. It is active intelligence gathering. Who defers to whom when a decision needs to be made? Whose opinion visibly shifts the room, and whose is politely acknowledged and then ignored? Who becomes defensive under mild pressure, revealing an insecurity that can be either avoided or, if necessary, used? Who speaks confidently but contributes nothing of substance, indicating a person more interested in the appearance of authority than its substance? All of this information is available to anyone willing to withhold their own participation long enough to notice it. And virtually no one is willing to do this because silence in a social setting produces a discomfort that most people cannot tolerate for more than a few seconds. This is precisely the discomfort the intelligent have trained themselves to endure. They understand that the first person to speak in any charged situation often reveals the most and gains the least. Watch skilled negotiators in any high-stakes discussion. The amateur rushes to fill every silence with an offer, a justification, a concession. The professional understands that silence is a tool of pressure. When you say nothing after a proposal is placed on the table, the other party's mind begins to work against them. They start to wonder if the offer was insulting, if they should have led with something different, if they are about to lose the entire negotiation. In the absence of your reaction, they begin to negotiate against themselves, and they almost always concede more than you would have been able to extract through direct argument. This same principle governs everyday social dynamics far beyond formal negotiation. The person who withholds immediate reaction to an insult, a provocation, or a piece of gossip retains a form of control that the person who reacts instantly gives away entirely. An instant reaction tells everyone present exactly which buttons can be pressed to produce a predictable result. A delayed, measured, or absent reaction tells them nothing, and in that uncertainty they lose their footing. You have effectively removed a weapon from their hands simply by declining to confirm that it worked. There is a further layer to this discipline that is often overlooked. Reading a room correctly requires a kind of humility that talkative people rarely possess. To watch effectively, you must accept, at least temporarily, that you do not yet fully understand the situation. And this acceptance is precisely what the ego of the talkative mind refuses to tolerate. The compulsive talker often speaks not because they have something valuable to contribute, but because silence would require them to acknowledge uncertainty, and uncertainty feels like weakness to a mind that has built its identity around appearing knowledgeable. The quiet mind has made peace with a more uncomfortable but far more useful truth. Appearing uncertain for a short period is a small price to pay for actually becoming certain before it matters. This is why the people who consistently outmaneuver others in complex situations are rarely the most naturally gifted or the most naturally confident. They are simply the ones who have trained themselves to delay judgment long enough to gather the information everyone else is giving away for free. In any room full of people eager to be heard, the person who is patient enough to be the last to speak will almost always understand that room better than anyone inside it. And understanding, far more than eloquence, is the true foundation of lasting influence. Every manipulator, regardless of how sophisticated their tactics appear on the surface, depends on one fundamental resource to succeed: your reaction. Manipulation is not simply the act of applying pressure. It is the act of applying pressure and then reading the response closely enough to calibrate the next move. A manipulator who provokes you and receives nothing usable in return is, in a very real sense, disarmed. This is why silence, deployed correctly, functions as one of the most effective defenses against manipulation that exists. Far more effective than argument, confrontation, or clever counter-tactics. Consider how manipulation typically unfolds in practice. The manipulator tests a boundary with a small comment, a subtle insult disguised as a joke, an exaggerated claim designed to provoke a defensive explanation. If you respond immediately, if you justify yourself, argue back, or visibly display frustration, you have handed them exactly what they were probing for. You have revealed which claims land, which insecurities are accessible, which pressure points produce a reaction they can exploit further. Every immediate reaction is, in effect, a small confession about where your defenses are weakest. The person who has trained themselves in strategic silence responds to this same provocation very differently. They do not rush to explain, defend, or correct the record. They allow a pause to exist, sometimes an uncomfortably long one, before deciding whether a response is even necessary at all. This pause accomplishes several things simultaneously. It denies the manipulator the immediate feedback they are seeking. It signals, without a single word, that the provocation did not land with the force intended. And it forces the manipulator to either escalate their tactics, in a way that becomes increasingly obvious to any onlookers, or abandon the attempt altogether because it is not producing results. There is a particular psychological principle at work here that deserves close attention. Manipulation thrives on predictability, and silence is fundamentally unpredictable. A manipulator who has successfully studied your patterns knows precisely which words will make you defensive, which comparisons will make you anxious, which implications will make you over-explain yourself. This knowledge is their primary tool. But this tool only functions if you continue to respond in the patterns they have already mapped. The moment you introduce genuine unpredictability, the moment silence replaces the expected defensive reaction, their entire model of you becomes unreliable. And a manipulator operating without a reliable model of their target is operating nearly blind. It is worth being precise here about what strategic silence actually is, because it is frequently confused with something far less useful: passive avoidance born of fear. There is a critical difference between choosing not to respond because you have assessed the situation and determined that silence serves you better, and staying silent because confrontation terrifies you. The first is a position of strength, deployed with full awareness of its effect. The second is a position of weakness disguised as composure, and skilled manipulators can usually sense the difference within moments. This is why strategic silence must be paired with an unmistakable inner steadiness. The manipulator must be able to sense that your silence is a choice, not a retreat, or the tactic loses its power entirely. This distinction becomes especially important in situations involving accusation or blame. A common manipulative tactic involves making a claim designed to provoke an immediate denial, because the act of denying, however justified, often makes a person appear defensive, and defensiveness is frequently read by observers as an admission of guilt, regardless of the actual facts. The disciplined response to this tactic is rarely immediate denial. It is a measured pause, followed by a calm, minimal response that neither confirms nor over-explains. Explanations offered under pressure tend to multiply because the anxious mind believes that one more sentence will finally make the point land. And each additional sentence typically weakens the position further rather than strengthening it. The intelligent understand that a single calm statement delivered without urgency carries more authority than 5 anxious paragraphs of justification. There is a final, often underappreciated benefit to this discipline. It protects your own internal clarity. Every immediate emotional reaction consumes a certain amount of mental resource. The mind that reacts instantly to every provocation is a mind constantly recovering from small disturbances, never fully settled, never fully able to think several moves ahead. The mind that has trained itself to withhold reaction preserves this resource. It remains calm enough in the middle of conflict to actually think strategically rather than simply respond emotionally. This is, in the end, the deepest purpose of silence as a defense. It is not merely about denying information to others. It is about preserving your own capacity to think clearly while everyone around you is reacting. Look closely at the figures throughout history who managed to hold power for extended periods, who survived the collapse of rivals and the shifting loyalties of courts, councils, and cabinets. And you will notice a pattern that rarely makes it into the popular retelling of their stories. Almost without exception, they were far quieter in private than their public reputations suggest. The image of the commanding leader constantly issuing bold pronouncements is largely a myth constructed after the fact. In reality, the individuals who accumulated the most durable influence tended to speak carefully, sparingly, and only after extensive private observation. This pattern exists because environments of real power are, almost by definition, environments of constant threat. Anyone surrounded by ambitious people, advisors hoping to rise, rivals hoping to displace them, allies whose loyalty is conditional on continued advantage, understands instinctively that every word spoken in such an environment can be repeated, reframed, and used against its speaker. In these conditions, the leader who talks freely is handing weapons to people who are actively looking for an opening. The leader who has mastered restraint denies these same people the material they need. This is not paranoia. It is simply an accurate reading of how power actually functions once you have enough of it to attract serious competition. Consider how this discipline typically manifests in practice among effective leaders throughout history. In moments of crisis, when everyone around them is anxious and demanding immediate reassurance or explanation, the most effective among them frequently withheld immediate comment, allowing the initial panic to settle before committing to a position. This was not indecision. It was an understanding that a position taken too early, before the full situation was understood, becomes a liability the moment new information emerges. A leader who commits publicly and then must reverse course loses credibility in a way that a leader who simply waited never risks. There is also a subtler historical pattern worth examining: the way silence was used to manage the perceptions of rivals specifically. A rival who cannot determine your true assessment of them is a rival who cannot plan effectively against you. Leaders who mastered this discipline routinely gave few direct signals of favor or disfavor, keeping potential threats within their circle, uncertain of their true standing. This uncertainty itself became a form of control. People who do not know exactly where they stand tend to behave more cautiously, more deferentially, and more predictably than people who have received clear signals one way or another. In this sense, ambiguity, deployed deliberately through restrained speech, functioned as an instrument of governance in itself. This pattern extends beyond formal politics into the more universal domain of reputation building. Throughout history, the individuals remembered as wise, formidable, or unusually perceptive were rarely remembered for the sheer volume of what they said. They were remembered for the precision of a small number of statements, often delivered at exactly the right moment, that proved unusually accurate or unusually consequential. This is not accidental. A reputation built on volume is inherently fragile, because volume guarantees that a significant percentage of what you say will eventually be proven wrong, ill-timed, or embarrassing in retrospect. A reputation built on rare, carefully chosen statements is far more resilient because there is simply less material available for that reputation to be measured against. It is worth noting that this discipline of restraint was rarely comfortable for the people who practiced it most effectively. Historical accounts of skilled strategists and rulers frequently describe individuals who were, by temperament, highly perceptive and quick-minded, the very type of person most tempted toward constant commentary. Their silence was not the product of having nothing to say. It was the product of a deliberately cultivated discipline, developed specifically because they understood how much their natural inclination toward sharp observation would cost them if released without restraint. This is an important distinction. Strategic silence is not the absence of intelligence or opinion. It is intelligence and opinion held under deliberate control, which is a far more demanding practice than simply having little to say in the first place. The historical record, read carefully, offers a consistent lesson across radically different eras, cultures, and forms of power. Influence that is announced tends to provoke resistance, while influence that operates quietly tends to accumulate largely unchallenged, because it never gives anyone a clear target to organize against. This is the deepest strategic value of silence across history, not merely protection from individual manipulation, but protection from the coalition building that inevitably forms against any power that makes itself too visible too soon, too loudly. Understanding the value of silence intellectually is not the same as possessing the discipline to practice it. And this final distinction is where most people fail to translate insight into actual behavioral change. The urge to speak, to explain, to react immediately is not a minor habit. It is deeply wired into the nervous system's response to social discomfort. Overcoming it requires deliberate, repeated practice, applied in small situations before it can be reliably deployed in situations of real consequence. The first practical step is learning to tolerate the discomfort of pause. Most people, when faced with a question, a provocation, or an opportunity to comment, feel an almost physical urge to fill the silence within a second or two.